Hi, and welcome to Vineyard Church of Lenore City's podcast. Thanks for joining us here, but know that we'll love to see you in person. We meet at 10 a.m. every Sunday at North Middle School in Lenore City. Come a little early for coffee and prayer. You can also visit us online at vineyardlc.com. Thanks again for listening, and let's get right to the message.
We are going to continue in our series that we are in this for the next little bit. Actually, I think I was looking the other day. We have like 16 more weeks walking through Luke and Acts, which I'm really excited about. I love teaching through books of the Bible together. So if you have your Bibles with you, don't read it yet. We're going to be in Luke chapter 5 this morning. And as you turn there, I want to ask you a question. Have any of you... Let me ask it this way. How many of you would say that knowing Jesus has changed your life? Most of us would raise our hands, and I believe that we mean it. And there's something real that happens when a person first encounters Jesus. Something shifts, something opens up, and life feels different than it did before. That's totally real, and I'm not dismissing that at all. But here's where it gets interesting. Most of us, if we were honest, would also admit that life has, over the years, since professing faith in Jesus, has settled back into a pretty comfortable rhythm since then. We've found a way over the years to follow Jesus that doesn't really cost us much. We've made room for him in our schedules. We've made room for him on Sunday mornings and maybe even in our daily routines, having a quiet time and things like that. And we've kept mostly everything else intact. Our ambitions, our finances, our plans for the future, the things that we're not really ready to address or talk about in light of who Jesus is yet. And nobody's calling us out on it because everyone around us is doing the exact same thing. Everyone around us lives that same way. But here's the thought that keeps me up at night. When I read the Gospels, I don't find a Jesus that people keep at a comfortable distance. When I read the Gospels, I don't find a Jesus who stays at a comfortable distance. I find a Jesus that people either run from or surrender to completely. The religious professionals are the ones who kept their distance, but the ones who actually got close to him were never the same in the long run. They didn't just add Jesus to their lives, they lost their lives entirely and found something better on the other side. Which means one of two things is true. Either we're the first people in history to ever encounter Jesus and walk away basically unchanged, or maybe we haven't really seen him for who he is yet. Because you can't really see Jesus as he is and walk away unchanged. There's a moment in Luke chapter 5 where this becomes very real, that this is illustrated best. And instead of an abstract idea, we actually find something real and gritty and tangible, and that is a fisherman standing in his boat, having an encounter with Jesus, not knowing that his life is about to change forever. Let's go to Luke chapter 5 together. I want to read this beautiful passage, Luke chapter 5. This is what it says, starting in verse 1. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, that is the Sea of Galilee, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats, so that both began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. I want you to notice in this story, specifically in the first section of this story, that Peter is not looking for an encounter with God. In this story, Peter is not looking for an encounter with God that changes his life. He's just a man getting ready for work. And being a man getting ready for work is when Jesus approaches him and picks him out of a crowd and partners with him in this ministry. Kind of set the scene for this. The place where Jesus was teaching, this area in the Sea of Galilee, is covered in rolling hills. There's just rolling hills everywhere, and it leads into this massive lake, and it's such a big lake that they call it the Sea of Galilee. And if Jesus wanted his voice to project enough that he could talk to the large crowd who was there, he had two options. One was to either go up on that hill, which then he'd be speaking directly down, and that creates some sound issues. And the other option would be to stand on some kind of platform so that his voice would reverberate and project so everyone could hear him. And believe it or not, Jesus is a genius. So what he does is he asks one of the fishermen if he could stand on the boat, kind of put off a little bit from shore, because as he projects, as he speaks, his voice rises up out of the lake, projects off the hills, and then back to the people. So it's almost like Jesus has created his own natural PA system so that everybody can hear what he's saying. And in all likelihood, Peter most likely was not even paying attention to what was happening. In all likelihood, I could just imagine Peter. Peter is like putting together his lunch pail. He's kicking the side of the boat to make sure that it's still seaworthy. His friends are washing the nets and getting everything ready. If he's anything like me, he's checking out his lures to make sure that they're tied on right, that he left the fluorocarbon at home and has the 15-pound braid on the fishing rod. Like he's getting everything set up and he's ready to go fishing. And then as the crowd gathers, piercing through the sound, he hears his name. As other people are gathered around listening to what Jesus is saying, there's one word that reverberates over all of them, and that is Jesus calling Peter by name and saying, "I need you to help me with something. Can I step into your boat and use your resources to minister to these people?" The point here is that Jesus often comes to us when our guard is down. Jesus often comes to us when we are not expecting it. He comes to us when our guard is down. I think we often expect, and I think this is probably the case for them just as much as it is the case for us as well, is that we often expect God to encounter us in the big and the flashy, but don't pay attention to the quiet and nonchalant voice of God that draws us to himself. Am I making sense in that? You know, like every encounter that we have with God has to, like the lighting has to be just right. The song that we want playing has to be playing. And not only does it have to be playing, it has to be playing at the exact point where there's a big build and I'm caught up in my emotions and I'm just ready and waiting for God to do something. And then that's where God meets us. If that is the case, more often than not, that is emotional manipulation masquerading as an encounter with God, not a real encounter with God. And more often than not, genuine encounters with God happen in the quiet. Genuine encounters with God often happen through conversation. Genuine, real encounters with God happen through those that we don't expect. So not only is Paul or Peter, I'm always getting those two guys. They're not confused in my head, just in my mouth. I'm always getting them confused because their call is so similar. Have you ever noticed that the call between Peter and Paul is so similar to each other? Peter is on a boat or getting ready to go fishing, and Jesus calls out to him. Paul is also on a point where he's, riding a donkey to Jerusalem to go persecute Christians, and he's not paying attention, most likely praying, and it's in that quiet time with the Lord that God encounters him and calls him to something else. The same is true for us, that Jesus often comes to us when our guard is down. Jesus often encounters us when we are not paying attention. And I think one of the other things that we skip over when we read this story is that as an experienced fisherman, as Jesus goes to Peter and he says, Peter, can I, after Jesus is in the boat with Peter, Jesus says, I want you to go drop your nets down because there's a great catch of fish over here for you. He says specifically, when he had finished speaking, so after Jesus is done preaching altogether, Jesus says to Simon, put out into the deep water, let down the nets for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night. We've been doing this all night and haven't caught a thing. It kind of sounds like me and Zach Gillis' fishing journey over the last year and a half. That's an inside joke if you're not aware. I'm at the point now where I don't believe that there is a bass within 500 miles of this place, just to be honest with you. I've fished every lake and every pond, haven't caught a thing. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, notice his reaction in this, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. And when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. I want you to keep in mind in this story that Peter is not a Bass Pro Shop fisherman. Peter is not a weekends fisherman. Peter is a professional fisherman. Peter is someone who is on the lake all the time fishing. It is his way of life. It is the primary way that he makes an income. He is an experienced fisherman. Peter would have known the best time to go fishing, and he would have known that it was not this time. But he sees that there's something different about Jesus and obeys his direction, even though it doesn't seem like it will work at first. In all honesty, Jesus' suggestion would have sounded absolutely foolish to Peter. Earlier in the story, we learned that these guys are fishing with nets, not lures. There's a difference between fishing with a net and fishing with a lure. You want the fish to see the lure. How many bass fishermen do we have in here right now? Maybe catfish. There's like no one fishes in here? Good Lord. You guys live on a lake, you know that, right? Okay. When you are fishing, listen, Ashley, when we lived in Columbus, Ohio, we lived directly across the street from a Cabela's, and Cabela's is like my Sephora. And so like she would drop me off my thing every single Saturday as I would go to a gas station. I would get a Starry Zero, which is delicious and way better than Sprite Zero. Don't get me started on that. I get a Starry Zero, and then I would go to Cabela's across the street and just wander up and down the aisles. I spent so much money on tackle to go fishing in some of the lakes that surrounded Columbus, Ohio. And here's the point. The more ridiculous that the lure looks like, the better, in most cases, it usually works. When you're fishing with a bass lure, you want the fish to see the lure because you're trying to trick them to go and bite the lure. But when you're fishing with a net, fish will swim away from the net because they can see it. They know that it's a trap coming. During this time, they fished with what were known as linen nets, which is why they were cleaning them. Oftentimes, as they scrape the bottom of the lake with the lures, it would pick up things like algae and whatever. And if you leave it alone, it grows and it begins to overcome the net. Sometimes mold can grow on the net, so they had to fish it or clean it after every time they used it. These linen nets, though, were often solid white. They were very, very bright white, which means that the fish could see them. And so imagine you're a fish. Just picture with me, just very quickly, you are a fish. Okay, say, I'm a fish. I'm a fish. And you see a massive net that's probably 24 feet by 24 feet coming right at you. It's not very difficult to miss it. And so this is the reason why fishermen at this time often fished at night, which is why Peter says we fished all night and didn't catch a daggone thing in this lake. Also, fish often swim closer to the bottom of the lake for safety and for temperature regulation. Peter knows if I go put out my nets right now, I'm not catching anything in this lake. In short, Peter is not very enthusiastic about the idea of going fishing in the middle of the day. But I want you to notice his response. His response, he says, "But because you say so." What would have to change in Peter's mind that he would be willing to override all of his knowledge in order to obey Jesus? What would have to change in Peter's mind that he knows something to be true, he knows something to be reality, but at the invitation of Jesus, he's willing to change his mind and do what Jesus says? Peter had to know that there was something different about Jesus. Now, the text doesn't say what this thing was. Maybe it was because Jesus specifically chose him to help him in the ministry, or maybe he heard or felt something that made him believe that Jesus was more trustworthy and that he could be trusted. Whatever it was, I think the truth here for Peter, and then the truth for us as well, is that sometimes obedience to Jesus looks like doing things that don't make sense to us in the moment. Oftentimes, obedience to Jesus, submission to Jesus, looks like doing things that don't make sense to us in the moment. There's a reason why there's a reason why following Jesus is called the Christian faith. And that's because it requires faith. Faith is not certainty, faith is trust. Faith is believing something about what Jesus says about himself. It's believing his person, it's believing his character, it's believing his word, and being willing to follow his way of life. Faith is Peter's response here. Now, Peter trusts Jesus enough to obey his commands to lower the nets, even when it didn't make sense to do so. And Jesus often invites us to do the exact same thing. I'm sure if I go around the room right now and I'm like, what have you done for Jesus that did not make sense to you in the moment? I had breakfast the other day with a couple in the church who was like, we moved here and we have no idea why. God said to do it, so we did it. I meet people all the time who are like, the economy is in the toilet right now. Gas prices are like $12 for a teaspoon. Things are crazy, but I, in obedience, continue to give financially to the church because I believe that that's what God's called me to do. There are people that I in this room right now, and I try to brag on you as much as I can. There are people in the room right now that are like, I work 40-hour week, I come home, I have other chores that I need to get done, but I believe that God has called me to work in the kids ministry, so I volunteer in the kids ministry on Sunday mornings. I'm exhausted when I get home throughout the week, but I believe that God has given me a spirit of joy, and so I want to volunteer welcoming people as they walk in through the door. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I have people in my life right now who have Tourette's, who have a stutter, who have dyslexia, and God has called them to preach. And whenever they preach, it's like God brings peace to them. It does not make sense, but because God called them to it, they step out in faith, and God blesses it. Sometimes obedience to Jesus looks like doing things that do not make sense to us in the moment, but if we step out in faith, Jesus always comes through. And we see this in the next section. It says, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' feet. When he saw the great catch of fish, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. So after obeying Jesus' command, after responding into submission to what Jesus asks of him, Peter sees Jesus for who he really is, and that revelation results in a perspective shift. It results in a realigning of his life and a realigning of the way that he sees the world. See, his confession, Peter's confession of his unworthiness and of Jesus' lordship becomes the prerequisite for discipleship under Jesus. Acknowledging that Jesus is Lord and then acknowledging that there's unworthiness for God to be the one who calls him into this action is the prerequisite for discipleship with Jesus, under Jesus. And it's there in that revelation. It's in the revelation of Jesus is Lord and I'm not worthy for you to even talk to me right now, that this catch of fish actually becomes the prophetic picture of what God wants to do with Peter. And this prophetic picture, the thing that's being played out before them right now, is actually the invitation to something greater if he will obey, if he will step into it. You see, Peter has a very real choice before him right now. In this part of the story, Peter has a very real choice before him right now. Peter has the opportunity to keep fishing or to begin fishing for people. There's actually a word play in the Greek here. Jesus, earlier in the story, says, let down and get a catch, and that's a specific word for fishing. And then later on, he says, I will have you fish for people. It's a different word for fishing. The first word for fishing means to catch, to kill. It means to catch, to kill, and then to sell. The second word that Jesus has used here is actually the term that they use for catch and release. It's to catch a fish and then to give them liberty. It's to catch a fish and then to release them. Again, Jesus is doing a word play. So either he can step into an opportunity to keep catching fish, or he can begin fishing for people. Listen, if he goes with the former, and he goes, I want to keep catching fish, nothing changes in his life, except for the fact that he's probably going to have a really cool story to tell people about a guy who used his boat, and then they went out, and then whenever they slam a couple of Coors Lights on the weekend, he's going to bring up the story again about, you're not going to believe the time that we caught so much fish that 2 boats began to sink. He's going to leave with that story. Or if he surrenders to the revelation and the call, it actually will end up costing him. It will actually end up costing him something. You see, when we hear the story, we think of fishermen as like the lowly class, like the fishermen are the people who are scrounging together a living, just trying to make it by. Fishermen were probably some of the most wealthy people at this time. Way more than the people who were farmers, way more than the people who even owned some businesses. So much so that that's the reason why there's this reference to companions here. The reason why Peter has companions is because he can afford to pay them a living salary. They're catching so much fish, except for the night before, obviously. But they're catching so much fish that he's able to provide a living, not just for himself, but for his brother and their 2 friends. And so in this, Peter knows that if Jesus is inviting him into something, it's going to cost him something. And this is the thing that if you leave here with anything today, and you've just blanked out on everything else I've said, this is what I want you to leave here with. Seeing Jesus clearly, seeing Jesus for who he is will cost you everything. Seeing Jesus, receiving the revelation of who Jesus is as Lord will cost you everything. Meaning it's either going to cost you not going forward with what God has for you and what God's inviting you to, which is just as much a loss as laying down things that Jesus is calling you to lay down to follow him. You see, what happened to Peter on that lakeshore isn't just a Bible story, it's a pattern. We see this all over the Old Testament. We see it all over the New Testament. We see it all throughout history. Every single time God calls people to do something, it costs them something. You can go all the way back to the story of Noah. When Noah is on the scene and God says, I'm going to have you to build a boat. What ends up happening? He loses his pride. People make fun of him. They mock him. Then Abraham comes on the scene and God says, I want you to leave your family and everything you have ever known and step out over here and go obey me, and I'm going to take you to a new land. And what ends up happening? Not only does he end up leaving everything he's ever known, but then he steps into different conflicts that he did not foresee. You can keep going on and on and on and on. Every time God calls people to something, it costs something. This is not only the case scripture. I mean, it's the story of my life. I've seen this in my own life. The hardest thing I have ever done in my life was leave everything that I knew in obedience to Jesus. The hardest thing that I have done in my life is say yes to Jesus and leave everything that I've ever known. Though I'd moved around a bit between the ages of 13 and 18, I had lived most of my life in Charlotte, North Carolina. My family is there. My deepest friendships, my oldest friendships are there. My personal history with the Lord is there. And in a very, very real sense, Charlotte is deeply symbolic to me as both a place of formation and safety, because it's all I've ever known until God told me to leave. I can remember having conversations with Ashley, sensing and feeling like God was preparing us to leave. And I fought it tooth and nail for well over 6 months. I'm talking, I would put up a fight. I did not want to leave Charlotte. Ashley and I discussed what we were feeling, and there would be this awareness of God's direction, and there would just be this excitement and this peace that would just rest on both of us. And then all of a sudden, this fear of the unknown would come crashing in and rob me of any sense of direction that I had. This sense of fear would come in, and it would rob me of any sense of clarity that I had in wanting to obey what God was asking us to do. And what's the story of what happens when you're disobedient to God's direction? Everything goes wrong. When you are disobedient to what God's asking you to do, everything goes wrong. Usually you find yourself somewhere knee-deep in conflict and pain, sometimes of your own doing, trying to figure out where God is, and all the while He's moved on ahead to where you're supposed to be. Because when I realized what God was calling us to in Columbus, it was actually in the midst of heartbreak. When I finally responded to what God was calling us to, it was in the midst of heartbreak. I'm telling you, I experienced some of the hardest pain that I've ever gone through in my life, to the point of suffering panic attacks and sleepless nights over broken friendships, broken relationships, broken partnerships, leaving everything. Partnerships were collapsing, jobs were ending, and it's almost as if God was saying, you can go where I'm telling you to go, or you can stay here and do this by your own power. If you go with me, I'll provide for you over here, but if you stay here, you're going to have to white knuckle it the rest of the way by yourself. And God was telling me this through people that I had never even met. Do you know how aggravating it is for someone to read your mail and you know that you're the one living in disobedience? I would go to worship nights around the city. I would go to events around the city. I would leave the state and go to other places. In fact, Ashley and I went to a worship night here in Tennessee. We were in Charlotte. I was on staff at a church in Charlotte. We drove to Johnson City, Tennessee to go to a worship night. And we were at this worship night, and this dude comes up to me. I've never met him before, and I still, to this day, have never seen him again. Comes up, taps me on the shoulder, and goes, "Hey, man, I don't know if this makes sense to you, But here's what I saw. I feel like God said you're resisting him, and if you surrender to him, it'll be one of the best seasons of your life. I hope that blesses you. I wanted to punch him in the face. Of course it made sense to me. Of course it made sense to me. That's what God was doing, and I was running from it out of fear. I wanted to keep white-knuckling it my own way. And obviously, I wouldn't be standing here right now if I eventually didn't surrender. And that prophetic word was right. The 2 years that we lived in Columbus to this day, I would say are two of the best years of my life. Not just in terms of what God has done, but just friendships were formed. And I received the mentorship that I've wanted my whole life. And things were connected. Like, it was just a beautiful, beautiful time. But it cost me everything. To this day, friends that I had years and years ago that I, like the deepest friends, are no longer there. A community that I gave my life to for almost 10 years is no longer a part of my life. It cost me everything. But the thing is that being on the other side of surrender and obedience and looking back, I would do it again in a heartbeat. Not the disobedience part, the surrendering, and just making sure that that's clear. You see, the question isn't whether following Jesus costs something. The text in Luke 5 makes it pretty clear. The question is what's keeping us from seeing him clearly enough to make the cost feel worth it. Because I think most of us aren't holding back out of rebellion. If I asked you, what's holding you back right now? If I said, hey, God's revealed something to you about what he wants to do in your life. If I asked you right now, I guarantee you not anyone in this room would say rebellion. I just don't want to do it. No, I know God said this. I'm living in outright sin. I just don't want to do it. But what I do know would happen, or what I believe is holding us back, is fear. Fear holds everyone back. Fear is holding us back. Fear of what surrender actually looks like. Fear of what ends up on the shore when we actually let it go. And that fear has a way of keeping Jesus blurry enough that we never have to fully reckon with him. So I want to ask you something. What are you white-knuckling right now? What do you have a death grip on right now that you refuse to let go of, that God wants you to let go of to take you into what he has for you next? Not in general, specifically. Because Peter didn't just leave stuff on the shore. Peter didn't just leave things on the shore. Peter left boats, he left nets, he left tackle, he left equipment, he probably left other companions, left a whole job, a whole trade on the shore and walked away. It was his livelihood, it was particular. And whatever Jesus is asking of you is also particular. You probably already even know what it is as soon as I ask the question. It's the thing that came to mind as soon as I asked. Here's what I've learned on the other side of surrender. Clarity very rarely comes before obedience. Clarity very rarely comes before obedience. I didn't get the full picture of what life was going to look like before I left Charlotte. I just knew that Jesus said, come. Peter didn't get a job description of what discipleship was going to look like before he left the boat, but Jesus said, come. And you probably won't get all the answers before you take the next steps either, but you can take this specific step. So here's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to give you a moment. This is not homework. You're not going to take it home for the week and then come back and report next week. We're going to do it right now. In a second, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And I want you to do one thing. I want you to name the boat. I want you to name the thing that you have to leave in order to follow Jesus. We're going to name it, and we are going to surrender it. We are going to say it to him. And when we're ready, even if it scares us, we're going to tell him that we're done white-knuckling it.
We hope this message encouraged you in your walk with Jesus. If it did, like, share, or drop a comment to help spread the word. And if you're in the area, we'd love to see you on a Sunday. Thanks from all of us at VCLC.